A new leader in our nation's capital. Pope Francis names Archbishop Wilton Gregory to the Archdiocese of Washington. We have team coverage from D.C. to Rome, including a look at recent history and leadership at the Archdiocese, from Cardinal McCarrick to Cardinal Wuerl. Plus, who is Archbishop Wilton Gregory? Day 2, the head of NATO wraps up meetings in Washington, D.C. We'll tell you what's ahead for the alliance. And my one-on-one conversation with former presidential candidate Carly Fiorina as she is welcomed back to school. We'll take you to the Catholic University of America's Bush School of Business. On EWTN News Nightly for Thursday, April 4th, 2019. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you to those of you joining us from around the world for news from a Catholic perspective. I'm Lauren Ashburn. After months of speculation and waiting, the Holy Father names 71-year-old Archbishop Wilton Gregory as the new leader of the Archdiocese of Washington. He is the first African American to hold the position and is seen as a moderate who can help the community heal from fallout surrounding the clergy sex abuse crisis.
We've certainly given our faithful lots of reasons to leave the church. I want to provide a few reasons to stay.
His appointment is a story our partners at Catholic News Agency broke last week. Archbishop Gregory replaces Cardinal Donald Wuerl, whose resignation was accepted last year by the Vatican after he was accused of covering up abuse. The Archdiocese is home to more than 650,000 Catholics in nearly 150 parishes. Archbishop Wilton Gregory doesn't officially become Archbishop of Washington until May 21st. Today, he met archdiocesan staff and celebrated Mass for them and took questions from the media, including correspondent Jason Calvi, who joins us from America's largest Catholic church. Good evening, Jason.
Good evening, Lauren. The Archbishop will celebrate many important Masses here. He'll also be the Chancellor of where I'm standing, the Catholic University of America. But this diocese has been rocked with months of scandal. The new Archbishop admits there's pain.
Archbishop Wilton Gregory walks into the heart of a divided Washington, a divided nation, a divided church.
I will rebuild your trust. I cannot undo the past.
He shares the stage with Cardinal Donald Wuerl, who a Pennsylvania grand jury said protected predator priests.
One of the ways Catholics have been expressing their anger, their disappointment, their sadness is by withholding contributions. For example, one of the wealthiest parishes here in this archdiocese has seen a $20,000 decrease a month in the collection plate. What are you going to do about that, and what does that mean that people are not donating as much money to the church?
Well, first of all, I think, unfortunately, we don't provide enough vehicles for our laity to have a voice in the church except through their wallets. I hope to make sure that there are other vehicles.
Gregory was consecrated a bishop when he was just 35 years old, and he led the U.S. bishops in 2002 when they adopted the zero-tolerance policy for priest abuse. He's overseen the Atlanta Archdiocese since 2005. He comes here at 71.
It says something very powerful that the man who initially was the fixer here 20 years ago, the healer, has been called back again to do this, because that was the time the church got it right. And after these long 9 months, today feels like a turning point.
The symbolism isn't lost. The anniversary of the death of Martin Luther King Jr. Today, the appointment of Washington's first black archbishop and likely first African-American cardinal.
Martin Luther did say that he has a dream, and this is truly a dream.
Archbishop Gregory will also serve as Chancellor of Catholic University of America, where Andrew Abella is provost.
I do see Archbishop Gregory as a great healer. He has a certain gentleness about him, I think, that will appeal very much to the people of the Archdiocese of Washington and the students in our school.
Soon, Wilton Gregory will call D.C. his home.
Some conservatives are very unhappy with this pick. For one, he invited controversial Father James Martin to speak about how the church can minister to those with same-sex attractions. And Atlanta parishioners criticized Gregory for using $2.2 million donated dollars to build a new home. Archbishop Gregory later apologized and sold that house.
Lauren?
Capitol Hill correspondent on a different hill today, Jason Calvi. Thank you, Jason. For Catholics in the Archdiocese of Washington, the clergy sex abuse scandal has hit too close to home. The Archdiocese of Washington has been embroiled in the abuse crisis since its previous two leaders, Cardinal Donald Wuerl and his predecessor, Theodore McCarrick, have been implicated in the scandal. In February, Pope Francis defrocked McCarrick. It came after a Vatican-backed investigation that concluded he sexually abused minors and adults over his long career.
Theodore Edgar McCarrick, Archbishop Emeritus of Washington, D.C., guilty of the following delicts while a cleric: solicitation in the sacrament of confessions, and sins against the Sixth Commandment with minors and with adults, with the aggravating factor of the abuse of power.
It was the first time a cardinal had been dismissed from the priesthood for abuse. And in October, the Pope reluctantly accepted Cardinal Wuerl's resignation after he lost the trust of his priests and parishioners in the months following the release of the Pennsylvania grand jury report. That report accused Wuerl of helping to protect some child-molesting priests when he was Bishop of Pittsburgh.
Monsignors, auxiliary bishops, bishops, archbishops, cardinals have mostly been protected. Many, including some named in this report, have been promoted. Father Schlert, identified in the report, is now Bishop Schlert. Bishop Wuerl is now Cardinal Wuerl.
Wuerl also faced widespread skepticism over his insistence that he knew nothing about McCarrick's misconduct, and flip-flopping in media reports about what he knew and when he knew it. With the appointment of Wilton Gregory, Pope Francis is shaping the future of the American Church, and the Holy Father took 6 months to make this decision. We go now to Edward Penton in Rome, who has more.
Lauren, the Holy Father took his time in naming Archbishop Gregory to Washington, D.C., 6 months in total. The question is, why was he chosen? For the Pope, he's seen as a moderate, someone who can engage with all sides, a safe pair of hands. His African-American background was also a factor, as Washington has a rich African-American tradition. And given the importance of the see, Archbishop Gregory is likely to be made a cardinal, the first African-American to be elevated to the College of Cardinals. Fellow African-American Bishop Martin Holley, formerly of Memphis, told me earlier today that all this makes today's appointment the most historical moment in the history of the U.S. Church. Back to you, Lauren, in Washington.
Joining me now is Edward Condon, the Washington, D.C. editor for Catholic News Agency, part of the team that first reported Archbishop Gregory's appointment. Ed, welcome back to our broadcast.
Nice to be here.
That was quite a statement by Bishop Holley. What did he say? It's the most historical moment in the history of the church?
Well, the American church.
Is it?
I think that might be overselling it just a little, but it's certainly a historical moment. It's probably one of the most historical moments, certainly for the Archdiocese of Washington, D.C. I mean, this is culturally, ethnically, and, pastorally a very diverse archdiocese, and we have a bishop who really reflects that.
Ed Condon, Archbishop Gregory promised Catholics today that he will rebuild their trust. This is very personal to me and most likely to you, as we are members of this archdiocese. What does he need to say to me, to you, to everybody in the archdiocese to put his words into action?
Well, I think actually Archbishop Gregory gave a great press conference this morning where he really addressed that. One thing that he said, in fact 3 times by my count, is, I have to tell you the truth. And that was something he kept coming back to. And I think making transparency and full disclosure and truth a hallmark of his time here is going to be really important in rebuilding trust. On top of that, he said that, in his opinion, a bishop belongs in the parishes, not locked up in the chancery. Now, I think if he spends a couple of months of the first year in his time in D.C. going around the parishes, really getting to know people, being accessible, open, listening to ordinary Catholics in the pews, I think that will go a long way.
I want to talk about survivors. Survivors often get lost in all of this. We're talking about, how horrible the church is and the priests who are the bad priests. But abuse survivors need that recognition. Do you think that this is a time for him to do that, to talk to survivors?
Well, I don't think it's possible to imagine Archbishop Gregory rebuilding trust without having an open door policy looking to meet with anyone who wants to come forward with an accusation. They've been mercifully few in the Archdiocese of Washington, and hopefully they will continue to be so. But I think it's very likely that he'd have a willing ear.
Mm-hmm. What else does Archbishop Gregory need to do as he is forming his legacy in this? The African American piece of this is very significant. Washington, D.C. is a majority African American city.
That's right. I don't think that it's something he really needs to work too hard on cementing. I think just being an active bishop in this diocese, being who he is, and the Archdiocese being what it is, that will take care of itself. In terms of his longer-term, wider legacy, it really depends on what kind of Archbishop of Washington he wants to be. He's 71. He's scheduled for retirement in 4 years.
75, right? Mandatory.
Well, mandatory to submit his resignation. As we saw with Cardinal Wuerl, you can carry on past that if the Pope wants you to. So I think it'll be interesting to see how Archbishop Gregory sees his own time in D.C. Is he looking to provide a steady hand, a return to normalcy for a scandal-hit diocese, or is he going to look to make his mark? He has both options.
Thank you so much. Edward Condon, Washington, D.C. editor for Catholic News Agency, who broke this story. Thank you. There is a lot more in the broadcast tonight. Coming up, what the head of NATO said on the final day of meetings in the nation's capital. And a former CEO and presidential candidate tells me about her new job and the problem with politics today. President Donald Trump says trade talks with China are moving along, quote, very nicely. He met today at the White House with China's top trade official. The question on the table, will human rights also be addressed in these negotiations? White House correspondent Mark Irons reports. Good evening, Mark.
Good evening, Lauren. Outside the White House here, we can hear a small but vocal group protesting human rights abuses in China, where religious minorities are being detained in camps. And the U.S. State Department lists the country's offenses from forced abortions to incidents of torture and murder at the hands of the Chinese government.
Got to be a great deal. If it's not a great deal, we're not doing it, but it's going very well.
An optimistic President Trump today, hopeful a future trade deal with China will save the U.S. hundreds of billions of dollars.
It'll be a great deal for our farmers. Technology, intellectual property theft, everything is covered. There's not a thing that's not covered.
But will it cover human rights concerns? We didn't get a response from the White House today, but News Nightly asked the Vice President about this last week as trade talks ramp up with the country the U.S. calls in a league of its own when it comes to abuse of its own citizens.
Will we see conditions on human indignities included in trade talks?
With regard to China, we're engaged in discussions about resetting our trading relationship. But rest assured, as our relationship with China continues to change and to grow, we're going to speak out and we're going to stand up for the rights of religious minorities in China and everywhere around the world.
The 2019 Human Rights Report from the State Department slammed China's record, including its treatment of the Uyghurs, an ethnic and religious community of Muslims.
The Chinese policy for decades really has been one of repression, one of limiting religious freedom, preventing children from going to mosque, preventing parents from even naming their children Mohammed.
And sex-selective abortions are among the other abuses in China.
Even under the new two-child policy, second daughters are very much discriminated against to the extent that they are selectively aborted.
U.S. officials say the Vatican's recent deal with China, believed to give China and the Pope a say in the naming of bishops, is actually hurting the cause of religious freedom in China. The Vatican is asking for patience today, saying the situation won't change overnight. Lauren?
White House correspondent Mark Irons. Thank you, Mark. Top diplomats from NATO countries gathered in Washington today to mark the military alliance's 70th anniversary. The State Department is wrapping up the last day of the ministerial, aimed at finding solutions to major crises. But allies are still divided over security and trade issues. Correspondent White Goolsbee has more from the State Department.
No alliance can remotely match the power of the nations represented here today.
Secretary Mike Pompeo addressing foreign ministers from NATO countries this morning at the State Department, saying the 70-year-old military alliance must adapt to confront emerging threats.
Whether that's Russian aggression, uncontrolled migration, cyber attacks, threats to energy security, Chinese strategic competition, including technology and 5G, and many other issues.
The secretary also called on member states to spend more money on their defense budgets. In the past 2 years, President Trump has demanded NATO countries who are not spending at least 2% of their GDP on defense to pay their fair share.
We as leaders have a duty to make the case to our citizens about why this work, why these resources are important to keep not only our own countries, but our alliance strong.
The president's push has caused tension among allies like Germany, who have yet to increase their defense spending to the minimum 2%. Another divisive issue is Turkey's plan to buy a Russian air defense system. Vice President Mike Pence has warned the Turkish government not to buy the anti-missile device, which Washington sees as a threat. Turkey's foreign minister, who met with Pompeo today, says the purchase is a done deal. Some NATO allies are worried Turkey is establishing closer ties with Russia. Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg is concerned, but says it's good the U.S. and Turkey are talking about the issue at this week's conference.
That's one of the important reasons why we welcome that NATO is able to provide a platform for also addressing issues where there are disagreements between NATO allies.
That was Wyatt Goolsby reporting. The Vatican upholds its conviction of the former leader of the Archdiocese in Guam for sexually abusing minors. Archbishop Anthony Aparan received another penalty. He is no longer able to present himself as a bishop. Aparan had denied the misconduct claims. The Archdiocese is facing abuse lawsuits from roughly 200 people, and earlier this year, it filed for bankruptcy. A preliminary report on the deadly crash of an Ethiopian's airline jet says the pilots followed all of the recommended procedures. Boeing, the American company that makes the 737 MAX 8, declined to comment. The findings are based on flight data and cockpit voice recorders. The plane crashed last month around 6 minutes after takeoff, killing all 157 people on board. There's more to come on the broadcast tonight. Up next, how students at the Catholic University of America are learning. They have a new teacher, a former presidential candidate. Later tonight on EWTN, you don't want to miss an interview on Pro-Life Weekly. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo talks to Catherine Hadro about the Trump administration's commitment to protecting life and stopping taxpayer funds from going to abortion providers overseas.
We're going to do our level best to ensure that the least amongst us, the unborn, aren't, with U.S. taxpayer dollars, aborted.
You can see more of her interview with Secretary Mike Pompeo tonight at 10 p.m. Eastern on EWTN. It is back to school for a former CEO and presidential candidate as she shares her knowledge with today's business students. Carly Fiorina teaches her first classes today at Catholic University of America. She is a distinguished clinical professor in leadership for the Bush School of Business, where earlier today I had the opportunity to speak with her exclusively. Joining me now is Carly Fiorina. Thank you so much for coming on EWTN News Nightly.
It's great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
This isn't your first time at the school at Catholic University. You gave a speech here in 2017, and what I admired about that speech, you said life based in values is a life with a foundation. How are you, through your teaching here, going to put the human person at the center of economic life? That is the Bush School of Business curriculum.
Well, you know, I talked to a group of undergraduate students in business today, and what I told them was you might think business is about products or profits or results. It's about all of those things. But business is about people and how people come together to produce products or profits or results, mediocre or excellent. Fundamentally, the best businesses, the ones that make the biggest impact over time, are those that understand that they have a contribution to make, and every single person has potential that can be unlocked.
But the business world is secular, and it is, as you know, as the former CEO of a Fortune 50 company, Hewlett-Packard, very bottom line oriented. So my question to you is, how are you going to teach these students not to get sucked into the trap that money matters?
Well, I was asked today, how do you measure a successful life? And I said, in love, moments of grace, and positive contribution. And lest people think that's just words from me, I also said to them, the more successful you become, the higher you go in an organization, the more opportunities there will be for you to sell your soul. Or to put it another way, to do anything to achieve the end. But what we know is that businesses that sacrifice for the end of the quarter, the end of the year, people that sacrifice values and codes of conduct to achieve an end, over time, that all comes out. In the end, character matters. Courage counts if you want to fulfill your potential. Humility and empathy are necessary for collaboration, and the means are never justified by the ends. The means need to be right.
I'm going to take your class. This is awesome. Thank
well,
you.
we all need a reminder,
and
a refresher course.
And especially women, I think, also need to know they do have potential. Another quote that you had from this speech was that everybody has potential more than they realize, gifted by God, and you have lived those words. How are you going to help other women, young women, climb the ladder in business?
Well, not everybody wants to climb the ladder in business. Let's just start with that. Reaching your fullest potential means that you understand what you want to do, what you're meant to do. I believe, as you do, that we are created on purpose for a purpose. And I think our purpose is to make a positive contribution, to change the order of things for the better, to unlock our own potential and to unlock the potential in others. I was asked another interesting question today. Somebody said, well, how do you know the difference between persevering in a difficult situation and quitting because the situation goes against your beliefs? And I said, well, you know, there is something in between those two. It's called confronting, honestly. And I've had many occasions in my career, which I shared with the students, where I had to confront someone and say, you cannot treat others that way. You cannot treat me that way. Those confrontations, those honest conversations are so important, and we shy away from them sometimes because we're afraid of the consequences. I think it's why the Bible talks so much about courage, and why the first thing I talk about in my book, Find Your Way, is courage, and why it's so important. Because without courage, we can do the wrong thing because we think that's the easiest thing to do.
You say leadership is not about the title, but about solving problems. Your perspective on leadership is interesting, especially as a former presidential candidate. Would you consider running again? Are you disillusioned by today's polarized political climate?
So I've learned never to say never. Look, I think that we get very confused about leadership because our culture lifts up title, position, power, fame, money, conflict, controversy, outrage. None of those things have anything to do with leadership. Leaders change the order of things for the better. And I think our political process right now is, as George Washington warned us about, so focused on winning that we've forgotten about problem solving.
Carly Fiorina, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And how many of you in the audience want to go back to school and hear things like that every day, right? For all of us here at EWTN News Nightly, to all of you around the world, thank you for watching. I'm Lauren Ashburn. Let's keep in touch online. Follow me at Lauren Ashburn on Twitter and at Lauren Ashburn EWTN on Facebook. Good night, and God bless you.